You may like to know that a book, A Killing on the Exchange, based on the story, is now available in local bookstores published by Grafton. Price £2.50.
Sunday night, live from the Palladium. Here's Derby with the lineup.
We have the great Howard Keel, the star of Dallas. We have smashing comedy with young Gary Wilmot, the crazy world of Mr. Norman Collier, the super slick, Wayne Dobson, great singing with Ruby Turner, Kim Wilde Jr., and special guest girls is David Cassidy.
A superstar lineup on LWT, live from the Palladium, Sunday night at 7:45. Hunter's back on the case tomorrow at 9.
What kept you?
Don't ask. I mean, I know she's beautiful and she's sweet, but she's also a suspect.
Hunter's in on the action tomorrow at 9 on LWT.
The news at 10 follows the break with Alistair Burnett and Sandy Gall.
Do you know me? I haven't been acting myself lately.
Excuse I, Possum.
Sometimes I get lost in my work.
I'll have them both.
But wherever I am and whoever I am, I shop with the American Express card. With this, I can almost always buy what I want. It says a lot about the real me.
The American Express card. Why not apply today?
The American Express card.
Don't leave home without it.
Tell me.
This brings back memories.
Precious?
Pure gold.
It must be something in the air.
Only the aroma of Gold Blend promises the taste that's rich, that's pure, that's smooth, that's only Gold Blend. Nescafe Gold Blend.
How about another reminder?
Nescafe Gold Blend, the promise of pure gold.
I spy with my little eye something beginning with T.
Websters Yorkshire bitter.
What about tea?
There's no comparison, lad.
No.
Private Stats.
What's going on?
It's broken into.
I knew it would be.
How have we got to get there?
How's Lucas going to get there?
How's got to get there?
I don't know. But I know a man who does.
AA Relay. We're all you need to know.
This is very nice of you.
He's a very nice
You're
man.
a very nice man.
I like him.
You're a very nice man.
Did you know the British are flying around America for only £53 a flight?
How?
If they book return flight on Pan Am, they can get £53 Vusa fares in the US and great money-saving deals.
How?
Just make a reservation.
How?
See your travel agent for Pan Am Vusa fares in America. You can expect more from Pan Am.
Scoop. William Boot must leave his family and home.
Boot. Boot.
His destination, Africa.
To Ishmaelia.
Scoop, a new film of Evelyn Waugh's classic novel.
Do I intrude? We're just moving all the suitcases, unpacking. We're coming.
What the hell are you doing here?
Oh, well, I'm supposed to be a journalist.
God, how incredibly funny.
Donald Pleasance is Lord Copper. Denham Elliott is Salter.
How did he spot Boot?
Scoop, brought to the screen by writer William Boyd.
So hot.
Michael Maloney is Boot in Scoop, coming soon on LWT.
At 10:30 tonight, the London programme investigates the London Labour Party's support of minority issues, in particular their controversial involvement in the gay rights campaign. Then at 11:05 in our late film, Michael Caine and Shelley Winters head an all-star cast in the classic sex comedy Alfie. This is LWT. A very good evening to you. Now, the news at 10 from ITN.
Wants a short-range missile pact and no chemical weapons. The courts told Mr. Saunders had his Guinness papers shredded. The Education Secretary promises more power to head teachers. The pub where police think there was a plot to nobble jurors. and the British are getting better at going downhill. Good evening. The Soviet leader, Mr. Gorbachev, has proposed a new arms deal with the West and a ban on chemical weapons. Speaking in Prague, Mr. Gorbachev offered cuts in shorter-range nuclear missiles without linking them to a deal on medium-range weapons like cruise and SS-20s. He said the Soviet Union had stopped producing chemical weapons and was building a plant to destroy its existing stockpiles. He spoke of a joint effort with the West against AIDS and terrorism, which he called the new threats to the world.
On the second day of his visit to Czechoslovakia, the Soviet leader got down to matters of deep seriousness. The leaders of the Czech Communist Party have effectively stifled any effort at reform in the past 20 years. But Mr. Gorbachev told them today the communist world needs a fundamental turn in its entire activities, a turn revolutionary in character. On the question of arms talks with the West, there were two new themes in Mr. Gorbachev's speech. The first was a proposal to start talks now on limiting shorter-range missiles in Europe, rather than waiting to link it with an agreement on longer-range ones. The Geneva talks have become bogged down on this issue. Both Russia and America are ready to cut intermediate-range missiles in Europe, but America insists shorter-range ones must be curbed at the same time. In the range of 500 to 1,000 kilometers, NATO has half the number of missiles of the Soviet Union. The Western missiles can only hit Soviet allies, not the Soviet Union itself, whereas the Soviet missiles can all strike targets in NATO's West European heartlands. America has insisted on the right to increase her shorter-range missile numbers to match those of the Soviet Union. Russia's rejected that in the past and has said today both sides should pledge not to increase missile numbers during the new talks. On chemical weapons, Mr. Gorbachev announced the Soviet Union had stopped producing them and was constructing a special plant for their liquidation. In the past, the Soviets have been reluctant even to admit they've got large stocks of chemical weapons, so to say they have been producing them is a new manifestation of Soviet openness. The West will welcome the Soviet plan to destroy stocks, but is still waiting for an international treaty to agree how such destruction would be verified. Mr. Gorbachev made a remarkable speech. In it, he made the first known reference by a Soviet leader to the subject of AIDS. After talking about the nuclear menace, he said, "Another disaster threatens the world, that is AIDS. If we don't pool our efforts to combat it today, it may be too late."
In the last hour, President Reagan has told Mr. Gorbachev the welcome mat is still out for a summit in Washington. And in a reaction to today's Soviet proposals, he said there should be simultaneous negotiations on short-range and medium-range missiles.
We have never believed in the linkage of those two weapon systems together, but we have believed that the negotiations should be simultaneous because they have a preponderant, I'm pleased to hear him say that, they have a preponderant advantage in the short-range weapons, much greater than we would have to offer as a deterrent on the other side.
Both Britain and West Germany have said the NATO alliance will study Mr. Gorbachev's proposals carefully. The Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, said in Chicago tonight that the Soviet offer would certainly not be dismissed out of hand. Earlier on American television, he said the row over the electronic bugging of embassies in Moscow and Washington should not jeopardize improved East-West relations. And Sir Geoffrey has also warned that a trade war with Japan would cause incalculable damage.
A cautious reaction to Mr. Gorbachev's proposal from British Foreign Secretary Sir Geoffrey Howe, currently visiting the United States.
I don't doubt his willingness to try and make headway on arms control. The priority that we identified in our talks with him in Moscow last week was the longer-range intermediate nuclear weapons. I think one has to take these things, as we agreed then, step by step, looking at each step with great caution.
Sir Geoffrey's been talking arms control with Secretary of State George Shultz. They cruised together down Washington's Potomac River aboard what was once the presidential yacht. Waterborne Secret Service agents keeping prying eyes at bay. Sir Geoffrey's message, the Soviets are serious about arms control and do want to do a deal with Ronald Reagan. Some reassurance there for Mr. Shultz. He leaves for Moscow at the weekend for talks which may be soured by the row over espionage. Sir Geoffrey's next stop, Chicago. He was here primarily to speak against trade protectionism, but he took the opportunity to underline Britain's determination to stand with the United States on matters of defense. People here seem impressed by Mrs. Thatcher's tough line with the Soviets. Mr. Shultz has apparently been asked to follow suit. The Americans have drawn up new proposals for the early testing and deployment of Star Wars. It seems that Ronald Reagan feels the time is right to press Mr. Gorbachev for some hard bargains. Tim Hewitt, News at 10, Chicago.
President Reagan said in his speech tonight there was no excuse for Soviet spying against the American embassy in Moscow, but added that such actions should come as no surprise. In Washington, Soviet officials showed reporters microphones and electronic eavesdropping equipment they say they found in the walls of their embassy. They accused the United States of spy mania and said American allegations were sensational.
Today, the Russians took Western reporters inside their new unoccupied embassy building in Washington, which they claimed was riddled with listening devices planted by the Americans.
Cameraman, organize yourself, please.
These pictures will be worth thousands of words, said a Russian spokesman as they led the cameramen to a room in the embassy where they had left one of the devices undisturbed. It was a dramatic moment of propaganda theatre, a Russian official pulling away the marble panelling to reveal what he said was an American transmitter, one of dozens they'd found and removed from the new building.
It must have been done at the factory.
How did they hook it up, though?
So, you know, all the marble was made in Georgia.
Open up the curtain, you know, just.
Earlier, the Russians had unveiled more of the bugs, just a sample, they said, of scores that had been planted in their buildings in Washington and New York. Some were marked made in Canada, others designed to be buried in concrete, some with batteries the Russians claimed could be recharged by remote control. They also alleged a diplomat had been blinded by an American spy laser.
And several years ago, one of the Soviet diplomats looked out of the window of his apartment facing the street, and he received a laser stroke. The side of one of his eyes was completely lost.
There's no sign that President Reagan intends to let all this get in the way of moves towards arms control. Asked for his reaction to the latest Russian claims today, he said, "If you want to believe them, then go ahead." Ken Reese, News at 10, Washington.
Here, the High Court was told today that the former chairman of Guinness, Mr. Ernest Saunders, ordered the shredding of files, diaries and letters after the Department of Trade began investigating the company. The claim was made by his former personal assistant, Mrs. Margaret McGrath. Mr. Saunders and the American lawyer, Mr. Thomas Ward, want the court to lift orders granted to Guinness, freezing £5.2 million of their assets.
Guinness lawyers flew specially to Majorca to get evidence from Mrs. McGrath, who no longer works for the company. But she did work closely with Ernest Saunders as his personal assistant throughout the 6 years he was head of Guinness. And during the bitterly contested takeover of distillers, she maintained monthly files on how the bid was progressing. In December last year, the Department of Trade announced it was to examine the whole affair. A memo was sent to all Guinness staff that no documents of any kind were to be destroyed. Yet, in her statement read to the court today by counsel for Guinness, Mrs. McGrath said that after the inquiry had started, Mr. Saunders asked to see the files on the Guinness bid for distillers. Shortly afterwards, she said, he gave a small bundle of papers to a secretary. She believes those papers were shredded. She was told to destroy the office diary for '86. Mr. Saunders removed letters between himself and 3 people involved in the distillers bid, and Mr. Saunders deleted names from the office address books before returning them to Guinness. In her statement, Mrs. McGrath said, "I destroyed the diary with great reluctance, but Mr. Saunders was unusually insistent." And she said he seemed particularly sensitive about meetings with the American entrepreneur Meshulem Riklis, who's married to the actress Piers Adora. He was a heavy buyer of shares during the Guinness takeover battle. Mr. Saunders' lawyers called the evidence scandalous, irrelevant and oppressive. He said Mr. Saunders, who's in Switzerland, would answer the charges and that it might be necessary to cross-examine Mrs. McGrath.
Details of a gangster's plot to nobble a jury were given today when an armed robbery trial ended at the Old Bailey. Police said a criminal gang had got the addresses of the jurors and had followed some of them outside the court. All 12 jurors were given round-the-clock police protection. 2 men, John Reed and Peter Mitchell, were sentenced to 22 years each for their part in the robbery. Tonight, the former Master of the Rolls, Lord Denning, said jury nobbling was a growing threat to British justice. He said it must be stopped at all costs.
It was a professional robbery executed with military precision by experienced raiders prepared to risk all for £500,000. They ambushed a security van, fired shots into it, then rammed it with a mobile crane. Reed and Mitchell were caught shortly afterwards. That was in 1985. Since then, they've both been in custody, Faced with the prospect of long sentences, they planned their get-out. There were two alternatives: escape or go for the jury. Escape was ruled out when the police deployed firearms officers around the Old Bailey for the duration of the trial. Reed and Mitchell were brought to and from court each day under heavy escort, their first trial beginning on March the 9th. Detective Superintendent Duncan McRae of the Flying Squad, that's him on the left, asked the judge for permission to place a protection squad on the jury. He said that a major operation was being mounted by associates of Reed and Mitchell to nobble them. Somehow, the gang had obtained their entire list of people who'd been summoned for jury service at the Old Bailey that week. The list contained the names and addresses of 500 potential jurors. Once 12 of them had been called to be sworn in, their names could have been checked against that list. At this point, it was admitted in court that a defence solicitor had legally obtained an identical list to ensure that none of the jurors came from the area where the robbery took place. Section 5 of the Juries Act 1974 not only allows defence lawyers access to names and addresses of jurors, but gives remand prisoners the same right. It was Reed's solicitor, Brian Rose Smith, who used this law to obtain the jury panel.
As far as I'm concerned, I know how many copies I took, and I can account for those copies, and any suggestion that my office has illegally, wrongfully distributed copies is an absolute nonsense.
Flying Squad Intelligence reported that members of the Reed-Mitchell gang met, unknown to the bar management and owners, in the Horseshoe Public House in South London. Here they organised 12 teams to target the jury. Detectives said it was an operation which Scotland Yard could not have planned with more precision. That first trial of Reed and Mitchell ended after 5 days. Some of the jurors were seen drinking in a bar close to the court. Among the pub's customers were relatives of the defendants. Tonight, Lord Denning, former Master of the Rolls, said something had to be done to prevent jury interference. Mounting 24-hour jury protection, he said, was an increasingly expensive business for the police. Many judicial and senior police officers would tonight like to see the law changed. Jury irregularities are increasing, and there are many now who regard the present legislation as being a charter for jury nobbling.
The Education Secretary, Mr. Kenneth Baker, announced plans tonight for putting head teachers in charge of their own school budgets. He told the Secondary Heads Association in Nottingham he wanted the change in all secondary schools and in the bigger primary schools, those with 200 pupils or more, by 1991. There'll be legislation in the next Parliament. Mr. Baker wants the heads and the school governors to decide how much of their school spending goes on teaching staff and how much on books, say, or computers, or on school heating or decoration. Local education authorities would still decide the total budget for each school.
The plans for new legislation announced by the Education Secretary tonight will need a radical change in attitudes, Mr. Baker said. But earlier in the day, there was no sign of any change in the long-running dispute with the two main teaching unions. A warmer welcome, though, awaited him from the Secondary Heads Association, where he unveiled plans to give governors and head teachers more spending power.
My aim is to get the schools themselves, governors and heads, to make spending decisions as they judge best. Decision-making should be driven down to the local level. I believe that the over-centralisation of decision-making in the town hall has greatly impaired the vitality and self-confidence of the schools as individual institutions.
The speech seemed to go down well, but there were some reservations.
Our association welcomes any move that gives greater freedom to the heads and governors of school to respond to the current needs of society.
Are you happy, though, with the amount of money that is going into education from the Conservative government?
No. We feel that education by no means has a high priority that it ought to have.
Mr. Baker says he wants to see all secondary schools and the bigger primaries in charge of their own budgets within 4 years. So it effectively means he was spelling out part of his party's manifesto on education for the next general election. David Chater, News at 10 in Nottingham.
Labour's education spokesman, Mr. Giles Radice, said Mr. Baker's proposals would force schools to compete for teachers and pupils, and the majority would suffer. He said some would end up packed with porter cabin classrooms, while others would close. For the Alliance, Mr. Paddy Ashdown said he was delighted Mr. Baker had taken up an Alliance initiative, but he suspected Mr. Baker's motive was to remove power from the local education authorities.
The South African mining company Gencor has been accused of butchering its workers after another explosion in which 34 men were killed. A report next. Plus, Mr. Steele meets a foreign friend in Ireland. And a princess meets a princess in the ranks. That's in a couple of minutes.
Two of London's top football managers, Ron Smart and Ron Slack, are in the race to sign United's star player. So it's the early morning shuttle to Manchester. Using Hertz Super Shuttle Drive, Ron Smart rents his car in the British Airways departure lounge. He gets Hertz computerized driving directions and a rate that includes everything, even petrol. Ron Slack will rent his car in Manchester. On arrival, while Ron Slack is queuing to do his paperwork, Ron Smart walks straight to his car. Ron Slack has to rely on local driving directions. So Ron Smart beats his rival by a short head thanks to Hertz. And Ron Slack beats his head until it hurts. Using his Hertz optional phone, Ron Smart gives his chairman the good news. But Ron Slack will have to wait to break the news of his signing. You'll fly with Hertz Super Shuttle Drive.
Happiness is a cigar called Hamlet, the mild cigar.
Do It All are doing 6 litres Polytex Brilliant White, $9.25. 5 litres Cuprinol Timbercare, $5.99. And £1 off 18 Bianco plain tiles. And that's not all you get from Do It All.
Everywhere there's a helpful Do It All idea.
I've read the fourth quarter, 2020 all.
There's one American airline that takes off over 1,500 times a day to 113 U.S. cities.
And now, after 50 years of flying America and the Pacific, they've touched down in the UK. Continental Airlines, now over here to take you over there.
"34 miners were killed and 16 others injured after an underground explosion at a coal mine in South Africa. The explosion at the Ermelo mine in the eastern Transvaal is thought to have been caused by methane gas. A similar explosion there in 1982 killed 11 miners. The owners of the mine also own the Kinross gold mine, where 177 miners died in an underground fire last year. The leader of South Africa's Black Miners' Union said the company Gencor was the butcher of the mining industry, intent on destroying as many lives as possible.
This afternoon, operations on the mine were nearly back to normal, although the area where the explosion occurred last night is sealed off. Mine officials are still uncertain about the cause of the disaster, but believe that the 34 dead were overcome by carbon monoxide fumes in the wake of a methane gas explosion. And in a nearby hospital, still dazed survivors of the blast could cast little light on what happened over 400 feet underground. A similar disaster occurred on the same mine 5 years ago, and the holding company, Gencor, also owns the Kinross gold mine, where 177 workers were killed in an underground fire last September.
It has become clear to our members and our union that Gencor, having failed to destroy the NUM in its organizing efforts, is now emerging as the butcher of the mining industry and is bent on destroying as many lives as it possibly can on an alarming scale.
As yet, no confirmation from the Chamber of Mines that a public inquiry will be held, and Gencor has declined to comment on what it describes as the union's tasteless allegations. But production continues, and while the investigation begins, the evening shift arrives to go down below, as usual. Mike Hanna, News at 10, South Africa.
The family of George Death, the ITN cameraman who was killed during fighting at the Crossroads squatter camp outside Cape Town, say the pictures he recorded just before his death were wiped in police custody. They want an inquiry. Mr. Death's sound recorders said they had carried on filming until the moment of the attack. It's thought those last few minutes of film may have shown who the attackers were.
Oxfam and other charities are planning a new airlift of food into Mozambique, where 4.5 million people are said to face starvation because of the civil war. Our first two special reports were on the South African-backed rebels known as Renamo or the MNR. For tonight's report, Peter Sharp has been with Frelimo, the Marxist government's troops near Inhambane in the south of Mozambique.
A Frelimo infantry unit on patrol in a village near Inhambane. Up until a month ago, this was a secure area for these government troops, but such is the ebb and flow of the war in Mozambique that today the Inhambane corridor has become Frelimo's latest front line as the MNR rebels push south towards the capital. Government forces in training. Even in a military exercise, Frelimo's perception of its enemy is clear. The MNR portrayed as a ragtag collection of bandits put to flight by Frelimo's superior firepower and tactics. Wishful thinking. Unfortunately for Frelimo, its success today in training has not often been repeated on the battlefield. Major General Fondo, a veteran guerrilla fighter in the war against the Portuguese, is one of Frelimo's top young commanders. But his troops are drawn from a different generation with little military experience. Frelimo, once an efficient guerrilla organization, today seems unable to adjust to its new counterinsurgency role. At Masinga, near Inhambane, another batch of MNR prisoners are brought in, captured during a contact earlier in the day. There are several hundred rebels being held in this overcrowded prison with little food or water. And after interrogation, it's the lucky ones who will end up here.
Viva Frelimo!
This, we are told, is a reorientation camp for captured rebels. Political rehabilitation for MNR prisoners who have taken advantage of the government's amnesty offer.
The bandits recruited me from Maputo. They asked me if I wanted a job, and I said yes. But I'm happy to be here because I no longer suffer.
At Chilikwe Hospital, further evidence of alleged MNR atrocities. Dr. Igor Veyes claimed he'd treated women and children bayoneted by rebels. Supplies of Australian grain being carried out to a sailing boat off Inhambane for transport to refugees camped across the estuary. The international community is beginning to respond to the disaster. But the worsening security situation in the south, with frequent MNR attacks on trucks carrying supplies, means that food is not getting through to the pockets of starvation in the province. And the food never got through to Luciano Manuel. At 2 years old, he weighs about the same as when he was born. The doctors told us he won't survive. Peter Sharp, News at 10 on the Mozambique border.
The central banks all tried to lift the dollar today, but it went on down and started more talk of still higher interest rates. So the pound ended, like everything else, up against the dollar at $1.6275, up half a cent. It's up 9.8% against the dollar this year. The London stock market didn't like that. It closed at 1,523.8, down 22.4 on the day. Inflation rose to 4% a year on the March figures, up just 0.1. The week's main job announcements. 1,400 new jobs at Pizza Hut restaurants around the country, 1,000 coming at William Lowe superstores in Durham, Yorkshire and on Tyneside over the next 18 months. 600 at Land Rover in Solihull, 250 at Hillard's superstore in Doncaster, and 110 at a new Trust House 40 post house in Guildford. Among the losses announced, 2,000 expected to go at Westland Helicopters at Weston-super-Mare and Yeovil, 700 at Bemrose Printers on Merseyside, 500 at Lucas in East Finchley, and 200 at Royal Worcester Spode at Stoke-on-Trent and Worcester.
The Liberal Party leader, Mr David Steele, was in Dublin today for talks with the Irish Prime Minister, Mr Charles Haughey. His visit took place as Ulster Unionists began a series of protests against the new Public Order Act in Northern Ireland.
The arrival in Ireland this morning of Liberal leader David Steele wasn't designed to coincide with any unionist protests, but talks with Irish Premier Charles Haughey centred on the Anglo-Irish Accord, an alliance government wouldn't change it, and according to Mr Steele, Mr Hockey's previous demands that the agreement be altered to remove recognition of Northern Ireland's constitutional position have now been dropped by the Irish Premier.
I think what he has accepted is that the agreement has the effect of a treaty, and that that treaty recognises the existence of the province of Northern Ireland, and he, as the new Taoiseach, is living with that.
The Liberal leader will now travel to Belfast, where no doubt tomorrow's Loyalist protest will give him some idea of the strength of Unionist opinion against the Anglo-Irish Accord. Michael Macmillan, News at 10 in Dublin.
Soccer in the Today League Division 4, Colchester, who still have hopes, won, Burnley 0.
Cricket, England won the Sharjah One-Day Cup and over £20,000 when Pakistan beat India by 8 wickets today. All the sides, except Australia, won 2 matches. England had the highest run rate.
Here, the Princess of Wales came face-to-face with another princess today at the Sandhurst Military Academy. She was representing the Queen at the annual review of officer cadets and picked her nearest to a military outfit for the occasion. On parade day, she spoke to King Hussein of Jordan's daughter, Princess Aisha, in the uniform of the WRAC. Altogether, 400 officer cadets got their commissions.
The best speed skiers in the world, among them 3 Britons, are gathering in France for the World Championships this weekend. They'll be trying to break the record of just under 130 miles an hour.
The world's most inaccessible sport takes place 7,000 feet up in the mountains. It takes half the morning to get everyone in position. Coming down the almost vertical sheet of ice takes less than 20 seconds. It needs courage just to set off. To keep going needs vast amounts of skill and strength. At the bottom, a timed section where 120 is regularly clocked up. It's a dangerous sport and one in which Britain is excelling. Scotland's John Clark is the fastest of a growing group of speedmen. His best, 125. And not far behind, the Wilkie brothers from Guildford in Surrey. All of them believe the search for speed is as much about science as sport, but all agree that the risks are increasing.
There's so much air flowing under your skis, you actually start gliding on a little cushion of air. So if you can imagine, you're like a little hovercraft, but you don't have an awful lot to steer with.
But along with the danger comes the money, a small fortune in endorsements for anyone who can break the elusive world record this weekend. All it needs is acceleration like a Grand Prix car and a terminal speed faster than free-falling from a plane. And for those who don't make it, the local hospital is just minutes away. Peter Staunton, ITN Sport in the French Alps.
And the main news again, the Soviet leader, Mr. Gorbachev, has offered to discuss the reduction and eventual elimination of short-range nuclear weapons in Europe. He also said the Soviet Union had stopped making chemical weapons and wanted them banned. President Reagan said the welcome mat is still out for a summit meeting in the United States.